This is part 2 of a series called Stuff You Could Definitely Try in a Small Town and Probably Get Away With It. Holmes County, Mississippi. The refusal of Holmes County, Mississippi to integrate its schools marked a sea change in American politics. Despite the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court ruling that determined that school segregation was unconstitutional, most schools in the American South still hadn't integrated by the late 1960s. When the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, the government started to get serious about enforcing anti-segregation laws. But Holmes County, Mississippi refused to desegregate. This opened the door for a black mom named Beatrice Alexander, with the help of the NAACP, to sue the school district for failing to comply with mandatory desegregation laws. She eventually took her case, Alexander v. Holmes County Board of Education, all the way to the Supreme Court in 1969. The Supreme Court ruled in her favor and said the district had to integrate their schools. But instead of integrating its public schools, Holmes County just opened 3 segregated private schools so they could skirt the law and keep their schools all white. Mississippi's state legislature appropriated the funds to establish these schools. 80% of their operating costs came from funds provided by the state, and the majority of those white students received tuition grants to attend those schools. These schools came to be known as segregation academies. There were tons of them all throughout the South. Between 1969 and 1970, white student enrollment in Holmes County public schools dropped from 771 students to just 28 students, and their parents all shifted their children's enrollment to the whites-only private schools. According to historian Michael Fuquay, they received books, supplies, and sports equipment from the public school system, and they often used public school facilities. In many Mississippi counties, private school teachers were even paid with public school funds. Many counties transported private school students on public school buses. Now, the real problem was that these schools were claiming tax-exempt status as segregated nonprofits, which violated the Civil Rights Act. So black families sued the Treasury Department for granting them that status. President Richard Nixon, who had played footsie with the South around this issue when he was trying to get elected in 1968, started to change course once he got the presidency, and he ordered the IRS to enact a new policy that prevented segregated schools from claiming tax exemption. Green v. Connolly upheld this decision in 1971, but by that point the majority of the white population had been disenrolled from public schools, leaving the poor black students to make up 99% of the public school population. Since U.S. schools are primarily funded by property taxes, and many of those black families were living below the poverty line in the wake of Jim Crow, Mississippi public schools were grossly underfunded, and sadly, not much has changed. Holmes County public schools are still 98% black. Well, that's actually incorrect. Something has changed. In the early 1980s, Mississippi Senator Trent Lott and North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms pressured President Ronald Reagan to remove many of the Nixon-era restrictions on these private academies receiving federal tax exemptions, and Ronald Reagan obliged them. Now, when Nixon's IRS started sending letters to other segregation academies in the early 1970s, particularly higher learning institutions like Jerry Falwell's Lynchburg College in Virginia and Bob Jones University in South Carolina, questioning whether or not they admitted black students, they did not. They started to dig their heels in. Right-wing political activist Paul Weyrich and Reverend Jerry Falwell, who had both been trying in vain to mobilize evangelicals to become more politically active, decided to lean in and shore up support among Christians using the issue of school segregation as a launching point. They framed it as a fight for religious freedom, and the message started to catch on in the evangelical community. Bob Jones University fought the IRS for years, but finally in 1976, after the IRS gave them an ultimatum to either integrate or lose their tax-exempt status, they chose not to integrate. So the IRS revoked their tax exemption. For a lot of folks in the evangelical community, that was the last straw. By 1980, in addition to the Heritage Foundation, you now had the moral majority, the rise of Reagan, and the new religious right, all because small towns all over the southern U.S. refused to integrate their schools. We'll try that in a small town. I'll be doing 2 shows this fall, one at Dizzy's Jazz Club in New York City on the 11th of September, and the other at Blues Alley in D.C. on the 15th of October. I would love to meet you. Visit the link in my bio or in this video's description for tickets.